Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we begin our new series, England's Worst Kings, with this first episode. Embarking on a peaceful journey through England's most turbulent medieval reigns, exploring two monarchs whose rules brought chaos, civil war, and lasting change to the realm during the 12th and early 13th centuries. We'll softly explore the devastating reign of King Stephen and the catastrophic anarchy that tore England apart for nearly 2 decades. From his controversial seizure of the throne in 1135 to the years of bloodshed that followed, and then gently moved to the tyrannical rule of King John, whose treachery and failures led to the creation of one of history's most important documents, the Magna Carta, all while England endured some of its darkest periods of medieval warfare and political upheaval. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about which medieval English monarch you'd like us to explore next, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from medieval England lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Stephen, later known as King Stephen of England and remembered for the devastating civil war called the Anarchy, was born sometime during the middle years of the 1090s. Historical scholars who specialize in his life and reign debate his exact birth year, with some authoritative sources suggesting 1092, while others propose he may have entered the world as late as 1096. This uncertainty becomes particularly significant when examining the events of the early 1100s and 1110s. This 4-year difference creates considerable variance in determining whether Stephen's actions during these periods were those of a child, adolescent, or young adult. There exists greater scholarly agreement regarding his birthplace, with most historians accepting that he was born in the town of Blois in the Loire Valley, situated between Orleans and Tours. Stephen's father was Stephen Henry, Count of Blois, a prominent French feudal nobleman of the late 11th century. He had already reached approximately 50 years of age when Stephen was born. If Stephen's birth occurred in 1096, then he would have arrived after his father had departed for the Holy Land to participate in the First Crusade aimed at reclaiming Jerusalem for Christian rule. Stephen's mother was Adela of Normandy, born during the latter half of the 1060s as a daughter of William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, who in 1066 led a Norman force across the English Channel and initiated the conquest of England around the time of Adela's birth. Her marriage to Stephen Henry during the early 1080s represented a political alliance designed to create a bond between her father, by then King William I of England, and the Count of Blois. Her father passed away in 1087 and was succeeded by his son Adela's brother, King William II, better remembered as William Rufus, most likely referring to his reddish hair or beard. Consequently, when Stephen was born in the mid-1090s, his uncle occupied the throne of England. Stephen's extended family wielded influence far beyond England itself. When William the Conqueror conquered England, he already held the title of Duke of Normandy and had expanded his authority over several other adjacent territories in northern France, creating a domain that controlled lands on both sides of the English Channel. Indeed, the conqueror regarded his primary identity as Duke of Normandy even after conquering England, spending much of the 1070s and 1080s in France despite becoming England's ruler. Following his death, his territories did not pass intact to William Rufus. Instead, the conqueror's other sons, Robert and Henry, assumed greater roles in Normandy and the other French territories, while William Rufus governed England. This arrangement collapsed in August 1100, when the king perished during a mysterious hunting incident in the New Forest in Hampshire, England. When this occurred, his brother Henry swiftly moved to claim power and became the new sovereign as King Henry I of England. With this development, Stephen remained a child aged between 4 and 8 depending on his birth year, exchanged having one uncle as England's king for another, while his third uncle Robert would maintain control over Normandy for several years. Ahead, though in 1106 he suffered military defeat by Henry at the Battle of Tinchebray and was imprisoned for the remainder of his life. Consequently, much of Stephen's existence would unfold under the influence of his powerful uncle who, from 1106 onward, controlled England and the family's territories in Normandy and elsewhere in northern France. As with any ruler of the High Middle Ages, only a limited number of administrative documents or examples of correspondence have survived the nearly 1,000 years since Stephen's time to illuminate his life. Consequently, we depend largely on the histories and chronicles of that era to reconstruct the events involving Stephen and his role within them. These were primarily written by ecclesiastical figures, monks, abbots, and bishops who maintained close relationships with those in power. One such work was the Historia Novella, or New History, by William of Malmesbury, a highly educated monk born in the mid-1090s who is Stephen's exact contemporary. The Benedictine monk Orderic Vitalis composed an ecclesiastical history covering the period until 1141, providing extensive insight into Stephen's life before becoming King of England and the early years of his reign. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a comprehensive account of medieval English history, offers an illuminating narrative of how severely the social and economic structure of England was damaged by the civil wars of the 1140s, in which Stephen played such a central role. Finally, the Gesta Stephani, or Acts of Stephen, serves as perhaps the most valuable source for Stephen's time as England's king. This text was anonymous, though some historians of 12th century England argue it was written by Robert of Bath, the Bishop of Bath, between 1136 and 1166, who witnessed many of the events described in the Gesta. Unfortunately, because it could not have been foreseen that Stephen would eventually become England's king, these chroniclers were not observing the obscure younger son of the Count of Blois during his earliest years, and we possess very limited knowledge about Stephen's early life. He was evidently raised at home in Blois and had numerous siblings, including an older brother named William. Under normal circumstances, in a society where primogeniture, the concept that the eldest son would inherit a noble title, was developing into its complete form, it might have been expected that Stephen would live his life overshadowed by his older brother. However, William is believed to have been intellectually impaired in some manner. There exists no clear description of this condition, but he acquired the rather harsh nickname William the Simple, which probably indicates some psychological or mental difficulty that largely prevented him from taking an active part in political and military affairs. In his place, Stephen and his other older brother Theobald emerged early as the most capable of Stephen, Henry, and Adela's sons. Another brother of theirs, Odo, died at a young age. Stephen received an adequate education during these years by the standards of his time, while his grandfather, William the Conqueror, was illiterate. Stephen was taught to read and write and could comprehend Latin, a sign of the Renaissance and learning occurring across Europe during this period as the continent's first universities were established and began producing new generations of scholars and teachers. Stephen's father was absent during his earliest years as he participated in the First Crusade to the Holy Land, which succeeded in establishing several Christian states therein. 1098 and 1099. The Count of Blois' contribution to this effort was questionable, though he was present at the Siege of Antioch in 1098. But he abandoned the crusade to return home at a crucial moment in the assault on the city. To make matters worse, he was believed to have met with the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos on his journey back through Anatolia and persuaded the emperor that the crusade was doomed and that he should not march forward to assist the Christian armies. In the event, he proved completely incorrect in his assessment, and after the successful capture of Antioch, the Crusaders proceeded to conquer nearly all of the region corresponding to modern-day Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine, as well as portions of Syria and Jordan. During his absence in the East, Stephen's mother Adela led a regency government in Blois. She evidently enjoyed the power this granted her, and as soon as her husband returned to France, she began attempting to convince him to depart again for the crusade as quickly as possible. He eventually consented to do so, and in 1101 left once more for the Levant. He reached Jerusalem on this occasion, where a Crusader kingdom had been established following his premature departure in 1098 the previous year. Before he could return to France, having fulfilled his vow to visit the Holy City, he was captured by an Islamic army and executed shortly thereafter. Hence, other than a brief period in 1099 and 1100 when he was back in France, Stephen's memory of his father would have been virtually non-existent. He grew up much closer to his mother, Adela, and, unusually for a noble child of the time, was raised in her household. When news of their father's death reached France, Stephen's older brother Theobald was made Count of Blois, though he was only 11 or 12 years old at the time, and Adela would continue to act as regent for several years to come, while Theobald had succeeded as Count of Blois upon their father's death. This certainly did not prevent Stephen from aspiring to a position of authority in France or the wider world of Western Europe. This was especially true given the difficult circumstances prevailing in England and Normandy. Henry, I had over 20 children, but most of them were born from relationships outside of marriage and therefore, by the standards of medieval Europe, could not be considered legitimate successors to his dominions. Conversely, he had delayed marriage very late, not finally wedding his first wife Matilda of Scotland, daughter of King Malcolm III of Scotland, until 1100, when Henry was already in his 30s and advanced age to marry by the standards of the High Middle Ages. Having married, the union did produce 2 children in rapid succession, a daughter named Matilda, after her mother in the spring of 1102, and a son named William Ethling in August 1103. Thereafter, the marriage produced no additional children, and so the succession to Henry rested primarily on just one legitimate male heir, William Ethling. Given the precarious nature of the succession and the absence of a spare male heir, Henry began taking an interest in his nephew during the 1100s. It was an indication of Stephen's promise as he matured that his uncle increasingly viewed him as someone who might play a major role in governing the French portion of his dominions in Normandy and adjacent territories. This advancement of young Stephen occurred in the years following 1106, after Henry's defeat of his brother Robert and seizure of the Duchy of Normandy. In response to Robert's imprisonment by Henry, King Louis VI of France began promoting the claim of William Clito, Robert's son and heir, to succeed as Duke of Normandy. This placed Henry in a difficult position, as it was not easy to govern his new French territories from England. Therefore, he began constructing an alliance of friendly French nobles that would serve to protect Normandy from attacks by Louis and the other supporters of William Clito. Part of this involved courting his sister and the lords of the county of Blois, and he did so by showing favor to Adela's favored son Stephen. Part of this involved Stephen spending considerable periods in Henry's entourage when he visited Normandy and held court at Rouen there. By the late 1100s, Stephen may have been as old as 16 or 17, and was therefore also in a position to accompany Henry on military campaigns in northern France. He even played a leading role in 1111 in suppressing the revolt of Robert of Bellême, a Norman lord with holdings in both England and the county of Ponthieu in France. The following year, Henry knighted Stephen, by which time he was at least 16 years old, and perhaps as much as 20 years old. Henry's patronage and promotion of his nephew continued in the years that followed. In the mid-1110s, Stephen crossed the English Channel to visit England for the first time and was given extensive privileges there. These included the honor of Lancaster, a feudal fief in the Lancaster region of England, one which made Stephen one of the premier feudal lords of the country at a very young age. Further grants of land in the Alencon region of southern Normandy and elsewhere in France followed. All of this was conspicuous by the late 1110s. It could be argued that Henry was promoting Stephen in a highly unusual fashion, almost as one would his designated heir. Perhaps this was due to reservations which the king held about his own son and successor. William Ethling reached his 14th year in 1117 and began the transition into his adult years by the standards of the 12th century. He may have been somewhat of a disappointment as he grew up, One chronicler of the time described him as a pampered prince who would be overwhelmed by the volatile and aggressive politics of the time. But as Stephen showed promise, whatever Henry's plans were, they were soon altered by an event outside of everyone's control. On the 25th of November, 1120, after a major meeting of the court of King Henry I in Normandy, the king, his children, and illegitimate children, along with the senior aristocrats and other courtiers, began making their way back to England. The king had made other arrangements, but the captain of a vessel named the White Ship, Thomas Fitzstephen, made the ship available to others to make the passage across the channel that evening. What was, by all accounts, a fairly intoxicated royal party, one which included the king's heir, William Atheling, and numerous courtiers and nobles, as well as several of Henry I's illegitimate children, descended on the ship. There were approximately 300 in total, more than the ship could comfortably accommodate. This was fortunate for Stephen, who was with the party and decided to disembark and wait for another ship to travel over to England, leaving the drunken party to head on without him. Not long afterward, he possibly witnessed as the White Ship struck a large rock which was almost entirely submerged in the harbor. According to the sources we have, all but one of the passengers drowned, an unusual development given how close to the shore they were. One might have expected that more would have swum to safety. Among the deceased was William Atheling King, Henry's only legitimate son and heir. His death would cast the succession issue wide open, and as a close male relative of the king, Stephen would become a major player in the scheming which followed in the 1120s. In the immediate aftermath of William Atheling's death, Henry's desire for a child of his own to succeed him became evident. Despite his lavish promotion of Stephen in previous years, there was only one option left: Henry's legitimate daughter, Matilda, a girl of 18. She had already been married for several years to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor and the most powerful feudal lord in a politically divided Germany. Despite the fact that she was a woman and that she was absent elsewhere in Europe, and had been so for many years, Henry moved to make her his heir designate in the aftermath of the disaster of the White Ship. Admittedly, he did also try to shore up the succession in other ways. His first wife, Matilda of Scotland, had died in 1118, and Henry remarried shortly after the White Ship, this time to Adeliza of Louvain, a daughter of the Count of Louvain, and a woman of perhaps little more than 17 years at the time of the marriage. The hope was that this second union with someone with many childbearing years ahead would produce a new, legitimate male heir. But there was no luck on this front. The marriage would not lead to further children for Henry, the barren nature of it most likely being due to the king's own advanced years, as Adeliza would have a child many years later when she married for the second time. What this meant in the 1120s and 1130s was that Matilda remained Henry's only living legitimate child, and the heir to the throne of England. There were signs already by the mid-1120s that Matilda would be a tough sell as Henry's heir. In France itself, it was generally accepted that a woman could not succeed as a queen, regnant, or major feudal lady, the belief being firmly entrenched that the primary duty of a ruler was as a military leader, and that this precluded women from ruling. The situation was more complex in England, a country which has had numerous female monarchs over the centuries. Henry hoped to placate his feudal lords and gain their acceptance of Matilda as his heir. In 1128, when after her first husband, Emperor Henry V, died in 1125, she was remarried to Geoffrey Plantagenet, the Count of Anjou, one of the more powerful lords of northern France, whose lands lay along the southern border of the Duchy of Normandy. This backfired, though, when the unpopular Geoffrey made the lords of England and northern France even more reluctant to accept Matilda as the king's heir. The ill feeling was compounded by high levels of taxation, which Henry was imposing at the time to pay for several border wars in France. Unperturbed, Henry convened gatherings of his lords, including Stephen, on several occasions between 1127 and 1131 to have them swear oaths to accept Matilda as his heir when he passed away. Despite these outward shows of obedience, a major question still hung over events. Would these oaths be honored when the king was dead? Or would the lords seek to crown a male monarch? While this political wrangling and unrest was underway, Stephen's Personal situation was changing too. Like his uncle, King Henry, he had left it relatively late to marry, but eventually, in 1125, he finally married for the first time, by which time he was either at the very end of his 20s or heading toward his mid-30s, depending on the year of his birth. To further confuse matters, another Matilda was involved, the third in our story so far. Matilda of Boulogne was a daughter of Count Eustace III of Boulogne, the ruler of the Boulogne fief, near Calais in the northeastern extremity of France and lying along the shores of the English Channel. The County of Boulogne was a significant entity in the cross-channel politics between England and northern France. Furthermore, Matilda's mother was Mary of Scotland, a daughter of Malcolm III of Scotland. Hence, Matilda was a niece-in-law of King Henry, her mother having been the sister of Henry's first wife. Accordingly, the marriage was politically astute and became even more important within weeks of the wedding when Matilda's father died without a male heir, and she and Stephen ascended as Count and Countess of Boulogne, further strengthening Stephen's position in northern France and on the southern side of the English Channel from his new lordship in Boulogne. Stephen continued to position himself to be a major figure in the succession politics of the second half of the 1120s and into the 1130s. He still was highly regarded by his uncle, who had facilitated the marriage union with Matilda of Boulogne. Stephen returned the favor by acting as Henry's representative in the region straddling northern France and Flanders in what is now Belgium. Here, William Clito, the son of Henry's brother Robert, was scheming to become Count of Flanders, one of the most powerful fiefs in northern Europe during the High Middle Ages. Henry was anxious to prevent this, and Stephen obliged him by undermining William Clito's efforts. This all stood in stark contrast to Henry's relationship with his daughter and heir, Matilda, and her husband Geoffrey of Anjou. They were pressuring Henry to begin transferring power to them before he died, principally by handing over control of castles and lands in northern France. Their argument that this would facilitate the succession to Matilda once Henry died was reasonable, but Henry did not view it as such, and the final years of his life saw perceptible tension between the king and his daughter and son-in-law. It was under this cloud of deteriorating relations with his family members that old King Henry died at the start of December 1135. Chroniclers of the time suggested his demise was due to eating too many lampreys, a type of fish. Perhaps this did play a part in his death, but in any event, Henry was well into his 60s by that time, and an old man by the standards of the Seco. I said that as news of the heir's death spread, Stephen was well placed to position himself as a potential successor. The king had died in Normandy, and Stephen received the news before most other contenders for the throne, as he was not far away in Boulogne at the time. Geoffrey and Matilda were further south in Anjou, and such was their unpopularity by that time that few supporters rushed to their cause. Another plausible successor was Stephen's brother Theobald, the Count of Blois, though it soon transpired that he too lacked the kind of support which was available to Stephen. Stephen moved swiftly to capitalize on his advantageous position. He and his closest followers mobilized and quickly crossed the English Channel to arrive in England within days of Henry's death. There they faced some opposition from Matilda's supporters. Nevertheless, by the 8th of December, Stephen was near London, and in the days that followed, cemented popular support for his accession in the capital and began taking over the levers of government. Over the next week, an agreement was worked out with the Archbishop of Canterbury, William de Corbel, whereby, in spite of the Archbishop's oath to support Matilda's succession, he agreed to crown Stephen as the senior ecclesiastical lord of England. Then a story was concocted with some of the late king's senior ministers through which it was claimed that Henry I had renounced Matilda as his heir on his deathbed and approved Stephen as his successor. Then, with the wheeling and dealing done, and those in positions of power convinced to support him, Stephen was officially crowned as King Stephen I of England at Westminster Abbey on the 22nd of December, 1135. It was just 3 weeks to the day. Since King Henry's death, and in France, Matilda was able to do very little to try to alter the trajectory of events. It was not the end of her claim to the throne, though far from it. In a somewhat unusual development, Stephen did not initially face military difficulties from rival candidates to the throne of England from northern France. Instead, the first 2 to 3 years of his reign were principally concerned with shoring up his position in England itself from fractious lords within England, and border incursions from Wales and Scotland. The most pressing issue was to the north, where King David I of Scotland had taken advantage of the temporary lull in English royal power upon the death of King Henry to invade northern England. The lands here around Northumbria and adjoining shires were contested between the English and the Scots throughout the High Middle Ages and late medieval period, and a diplomatic realignment pursuant to a change of king was a common reason for outbreaks of hostilities along the border. This one was more substantial than others, with David marching well into England and seizing the important northern towns of Carlisle and Newcastle. In response, Stephen marched north early in 1136 and campaigned against the Scots. Clashes over several weeks were enough to convince both monarchs of the wisdom of finding a swift solution. Stephen, who was anxious to end the campaign and return south in order to continue consolidating his position, ceded Carlisle to David in return for peace. With this concluded, Stephen headed south again. No sooner had he returned southward than Stephen had to engage with an incursion from several Welsh lords into the March region between eastern Wales and the English West Midlands. The Normans had begun efforts to conquer Wales during the reign of Stephen's grandfather, William the Conqueror, but this was only ever a partial conquest and would not be fully completed until the late 13th century, while Stephen was absent in the north campaigning against the Scots. Several Welsh lords revolted, winning a significant victory at the Battle of Crugmar in January 1136. By the summer of 1136, there was a full revolt in progress in South Wales, led by figures like Owain Gwynedd, one of the Welsh princes. Stephen and several Norman marcher lords campaigned aggressively against them in the months that followed. But as with the Scottish border, Stephen was not committed to winning victory, merely to limiting any potential damage which war might cause. In 1137, he agreed to peace terms through which the English state left the Welsh lords to manage themselves for a generation to come. That Stephen would make no further effort to intervene in Wales over his reign was due to the outbreak of the Civil War, which would characterize both his reign and the entirety of English political history for a decade and a half in the middle of the 12th century. The Anarchy began in 1138, a civil war which pitted Stephen and his supporters against those who wished to uphold old King Henry's desire for his legitimate daughter, Matilda, to succeed him. Matilda and her husband Geoffrey of Anjou had been committed to challenging Stephen's accession from the very beginning of the reign, but it was not until 1138 that they were in a position to press their cause. The Civil War was ignited when 2 very powerful English lords agreed to join their cause. These were Robert, Earl of Gloucester, an illegitimate son of King Henry I, and thus a half-brother of Matilda's. He was one of the leading peers of the realm and had made clear from the very beginning that he was uneasy with the manner in which Stephen had usurped the throne in December 1135. In 1138, he agreed to take up arms in support of Matilda II. Was Ranulph, Earl of Chester. He was a leading Anglo-Norman magnate. Some of his lands in the north of England had been sacrificed by Stephen as the price of peace with the Scots in 1136. And his resentment at this led him to join the revolt when it began in 1138. Thus, with support from senior lords on both sides of the English Channel, Matilda and Geoffrey entered open conflict with Stephen. The first stages of the war occurred in 1139 when the Angevins, so named for the fact that Matilda's husband was the Count of Anjou, invaded England from northern France. With the die cast, Matilda's supporters made their allegiances clear. The dead King Henry's widow, Adeliza, also threw her support behind her stepdaughter in the months that followed, and into 1140. The battle lines were drawn as Matilda's faction won control over much of northern England, where Ranulph of Chester was one of the preeminent feudal lords, and in western England, with the port city of Bristol emerging as a stronghold for Matilda in the region. Buoyed by Robert of Gloucester's strong position here, Meanwhile, Stephen retained control of the bulk of southern and eastern England, a position which gave him control of London, Oxford, and the wealthier parts of England around Kent and Sussex in the south, as well as into East Anglia and beyond, although some parts of the country would be gained and lost by both Stephen and Matilda's supporters over the years. This was the general geopolitical situation which would pertain for much of the Civil War that was just beginning. Yet often the map was more complicated still, as local lords and magnates, or even church figures like the Bishop of Ely, gained control of small patches of land and shifted allegiances over and back as they tried to benefit themselves during the prolonged period of uncertainty. It was this chaotic situation, combined with the violence and the breakdown of royal government, which partly led to the Civil War becoming known as the Anarchy. One of the most critical episodes in the entire war began in the first days of 1141 when Stephen and his followers laid siege to Lincoln Castle, where Ranulph of Chester and some of his closest supporters were lodging. Stephen hoped to win this key stronghold lying between East Anglia and York in the north. At first, Ranulph seemed to be caught unprepared, but the move soon turned against Stephen when, at the start of February 1141, Robert of Gloucester arrived at Lincoln to relieve the siege and to try to strike a decisive blow against Stephen's cause. The resulting Battle of Lincoln was one of the most important clashes of the entire Civil War, though it probably involved little more than 1,000 men on either side, an indication of the limited nature of warfare in 12th century England. Gloucester and his allies had the better of it, owing to a large contingent of Welsh auxiliaries who had joined Matilda's cause in 1139. As their position became clear, many of Stephen's most important knights and allies fled from the field, and the battle soon turned into little more than an effort by Stephen and a small band of knights to try and fight their way to safety. They did not succeed, and by the time the clash ended, Robert of Gloucester and Ranulph of Chester were not just victorious, but had managed to capture Stephen as well. In the aftermath of the Battle of Lincoln, Stephen was taken back as a prisoner by Gloucester to the West Midlands and was presented to Matilda. She ordered his confinement in Bristol Castle, and deliberations were now entered into as to what should be done. Matilda had seemingly won a clear victory, but Stephen was crowned an anointed king, and in both canon and common law could not simply be dispensed with without a clear legal justification. Hence, several weeks of negotiations followed, in which several senior archbishops and bishops of the English Church indicated their willingness to support Stephen's deposition and the crowning of Matilda as queen, though others refused. In the end, the breakthrough came when Stephen indicated from his confinement at Bristol that his supporters should allow Matilda to become queen. In the circumstances, he probably felt he had little choice, and so in April 1141, Stephen was, to all intents and purposes, deposed, and Matilda became queen. Unusually, she took the title Domina Anglorum, meaning Lady of the English, rather than Queen, while many chroniclers of the High Middle Ages and for centuries afterward refer to her as Empress Matilda rather than Queen Matilda, a designation owing to her first marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor and her position as his empress. Matilda also continued to use the title long after leaving Germany. This uncertainty around her title reflected the realities of her limited power. When Matilda and her supporters attempted to descend on London to have her crowned at Westminster, the Londoners rejected her and remained steadfast in their loyalty to Stephen. In this fluid situation, with Matilda having emerged temporarily victorious over Stephen, the king himself imprisoned, though with parts of England refusing to acknowledge Matilda, the political landscape in northern France also experienced an important change when news reached the county of Anjou of the defeat and capture of Stephen at Lincoln. Matilda's husband Geoffrey of Anjou invaded the Duchy of Normandy and occupied much of it. Stephen's older brother Theobald, Count of Blois, did very little to stop him, being conscious of both the difficulty of withstanding the onslaught with Stephen's fortunes in such decline in England, and also having his own troubles to contend with against the French monarchy. The Angevins would retain control over most of Normandy throughout the 1140s and into the early 1150s, and henceforth the Civil War would largely be contained to England itself. Geoffrey of Anjou was even able to have himself formally acknowledged by many of the Norman lords as Duke of Normandy in 1144. Stephen's cause was at an extreme low ebb in the spring of 1141. However, all was not lost. Though captive himself, his wife Matilda of Boulogne proved herself to be a capable leader of his cause, while Stephen was being held at Bristol, and she soon managed to reassemble an alliance of some of England's leading magnates to resist Matilda's ascension to power, aided considerably by Stephen's brother Henry, Bishop of Winchester. They also had the support of William of Ypres, the leader of a major contingent of Flemish mercenaries from the Low Countries. In the autumn of 1141, their combined forces marched toward Winchester, where Matilda and Gloucester's armies were trying to secure the region for her, and have the lords there acknowledge Matilda's accession as queen. What followed at Winchester on the 14th of September 1141 was a direct inversion of the result at the Battle of Lincoln 7 months earlier. Matilda's forces were routed and heavily defeated, and Robert of Gloucester was taken captive in the aftermath of the engagement. Matilda of Boulogne and Bishop Henry of Winchester were able to trade Gloucester's release for the release of Stephen. Set at liberty at the beginning of November 1141, Stephen began to re-establish himself as king, and in December, he and his wife undertook a second coronation as a means of reaffirming Stephen's position as King of England, and in an effort to delegitimize Matilda's accession months earlier. Matilda was never formally deposed, and so across the 1140s, there was a rival queen regnant in the shape of Empress Matilda and a king regnant in the shape of King Stephen. The anarchy would continue unabated for many years to come, despite the dramatic events of 1141. Having fortuitously gained his freedom in the late autumn of 1141 and begun to restore his authority, it all nearly came to a shuddering halt for Stephen the following year. Early in 1142, he fell seriously ill. What caused his illness has never been satisfactorily resolved. It could well have been the case that the circumstances of his imprisonment at Bristol Castle for several months the previous year had weakened his system and left him ill. The conditions might have been such that pneumonia or all manner of other sicknesses are possible. Whatever the cause, it is clear that contemporaries believed that Stephen was on the verge of death in the spring of 1142. Then, somewhat miraculously, he made a swift recovery and began an energetic new military campaign, one in which he managed to win over Rainulf of Chester for a brief time to his side in the war before laying siege to Oxford in the autumn of 1142. Empress Matilda was there at the time, and Stephen very nearly captured her, something which would have surely led to a major shift in the course of the war had he done so. It was not to be, though. Matilda and a handful of close supporters slipped out of Oxford Castle under the cover of night and made their way westward. After the dramatic events of the years between 1140 and 1142, the years that followed in the mid to 1140s saw the Civil War enter into a period of stalemate. Neither side made a major breakthrough, although at the same time there were near constant clashes between regional supporters of both Stephen and Matilda's causes. The conflict was extremely damaging, and many chroniclers of the time noted the devastation wrought across England and northern France. Agriculture was interrupted across the Norman dominions, and there was a general economic decline after a lengthy period of improvement under Henry I. Scores of castles were destroyed, and towns and villages sacked brutally by wandering bands of soldiers on both sides of the divide. It was this general sense of a land experiencing devastation for years which led the chroniclers to lament it so much, and for subsequent historians to term it the Anarchy. Like many modern wars, it also led to innovations. The incessant warfare and the destruction of existing motte and bailey wooden castles led to a swift adoption of the new concept of stronger stone castles, particularly in England, where motte and bailey fortifications still dotted the countryside. As destructive as the Anarchy was, it ushered in a period in the second half of the 12th century and into the 13th and 14th in which some of England's finest stone castles were erected. By this time, Stephen was entering his 50s, and Matilda was also well into her 40s. Therefore, as the Anarchy continued, the focus of it shifted in the course of the 1140s from Stephen and his cousin as rival contenders for the throne to their own offspring. Stephen and his wife Matilda of Boulogne had several children by then. Their eldest son Eustace was born around 1130, from the point at which Stephen claimed the throne of England in December 1135. Eustace was the next in line to become King of England, though clearly his position politically was marginal while still a child by the mid-1140s. However, he was old enough to be promoted and was expected to engage in military campaigning himself. In 1146, he was promoted to the position of Count of Boulogne in France, and knighted not long afterward as his father began preparing him to succeed him one day. Stephen and Matilda also had a daughter named Marie, who was born in 1136. In the late 1140s, Stephen began promoting her to play a prominent role in the female religious orders in England, a position which was essentially political in the High Middle Ages. Such was the power and wealth of the medieval religious orders. Another son, William, was married to Isabel de Warenne, the only legitimate child of William de Warenne, 3rd Earl of Surrey, in 1148, just a few months after Surrey had died. With this, William was promoted to become Earl of Surrey through marriage at just 11 years of age. Finally, like his uncle Henry I, Stephen also had illegitimate children, the foremost of which was a son named Gervas, who Stephen had made the abbot of Westminster Abbey in 1138, an important ecclesiastical office which he abused through his corrupt behavior. All of this was designed to embed Stephen's wider family into the political and aristocratic world of England, and to shore up his dynasty in the process. A similar situation was developing across the English Channel in the county of Anjou. Matilda and Geoffrey had 3 sons in the 1130s. Chief among these was their eldest son, Henry, an heir who became known to the chroniclers of the time as Henry Fitz-Empressfitz, meaning son of Foix, and the Empress referring to his mother's first marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor and continuing use of the title of Empress. Henry was born in March 1133 and was just a few years younger than Stephen's eldest son, Eustace, already by 1142 when he was just 9 years of age. His parents began involving Henry in the politics of the Civil War and sent him to England to spend time in the household of his step-uncle, Robert of Gloucester. The point of this was to present in person Matilda's heir to the English lords who supported her cause. Henry, after all, would be her successor one day if she was to emerge victorious in the Civil War. And this is increasingly how the Civil War began to develop in the second half of the 1140s and into the early 1150s. It was no longer a conflict to see if Stephen or Matilda would rule in the long run, but which might emerge victorious in their old age and ensure the succession of their son Eustace of Boulogne or Henry of Anjou. The 2 sons became more central to the military campaigning as the years went by, especially on Matilda's side. After her second husband and Henry's father, Geoffrey of Anjou, died in September 1151, at which juncture young Henry became the de facto head of Matilda's military campaign, even as the caste of those who were involved in the fighting changed. It remained a somewhat timid affair, such that several historians of the High Middle Ages have questioned whether we should even speak of a continuation of the Civil War in the late 1140s. One feature of this was the death of Robert of Gloucester in October 1147, with the passing of one of Matilda's foremost supporters in England. The political and military landscape changed further so that Stephen and his allies were now more secure in their control of England, while Matilda and the supporters of the Angevins continued to control the Norman dominions across northern France. Another development was that the Second Crusade to the Holy Land began in 1145 and lasted down to 1149, in response to the conquest of the county of Edessa by the Muslim powers of the Levant. In 1144, this drew many of the lords and soldiers who might have continued the war between Stephen and Matilda away from Western Europe to the east. In this environment, Henry tried to launch several invasions of England in the second half of the 1140s. But these amounted to very little. In one instance, Stephen simply paid off the mercenaries that Henry's army was largely comprised of and ordered them to return home to France. The final stages in the anarchy came in the early 1150s. By then, Stephen's position had been somewhat weakened owing to a dispute which had emerged between him and the Church. Authorities in England since the mid-1140s, while Ranulph of Chester continued to hold control over large stretches of the north of England in 1153, Henry Fitz-Empress, who by then had succeeded as Count of Anjou and was able to deploy greater resources than on previous occasions, arrived in England again, where he built up support around Bristol and the surrounding region for his and his mother's cause. A period of pronounced military engagement and clashes followed over several months. Much of it focused on a siege of Wallingford Castle in Oxfordshire. On the periphery of Henry and Stephen's spheres of control, something very unusual happened. At this juncture, many of Stephen and Henry's closest supporters now indicated an unwillingness to participate in a new bout of violent engagements which could destabilize England in a way not seen since the early 1140s. Faced with this unprecedented situation, Stephen and Henry entered negotiations which were brokered by leading members of the English Church. The end result was the Treaty of Wallingford, also known as the Treaty of Winchester, which was agreed at the scene of the siege late in 1153. Under the terms of this, Stephen, who knew that he now faced a young, energetic, and capable enemy in the shape of Henry, and who was also in a difficult position when it came to church support in England, agreed that Henry would succeed him when he died, something which many people assumed was not many years away, given that Stephen was around 60 years of age by that time. This involved Stephen abandoning the claims of his sons to succeed him as King of England, but would ensure peace during Stephen's final years. The Wallingford Agreement was confirmed shortly afterward by a more formal treaty agreed upon at Winchester. The Treaty of Wallingford was a peculiar agreement. Through it, Stephen had effectively renounced the claims of his son Eustace or any of his other children to the throne of England. Eustace was clearly disgruntled with the decision, though there is a debate as to whether or not Stephen did genuinely intend to accept the terms of the treaty, or if he was simply buying time in which to strengthen his position again and would then recommence the war and impose Eustace as his heir. This latter theory certainly corresponds with some of his actions following the agreement. The months after Wallingford was finalized saw Stephen engaging in a flurry of activity. First, he tried to reduce the power of Hugh Bigod, a perennially overmighty feudal lord in England, while he was also building up his military base once again. A setback occurred when Eustace died suddenly and prematurely in the autumn of 1153, though Stephen's other son William now became a potential heir to Stephen. Questions remain as to whether Stephen was planning to eventually renounce the terms of the Wallingford Agreement and to try and make William his heir once he had built up enough strength and support for such a move. If this was Stephen's plan, it would never come to fruition. By the time the Wallingford Agreement was reached in 1153, the king was at least 57 years of age, depending on the time of his birth, and perhaps into his early 60s old age in the 12th century. Despite his advanced years, he spent the first months of 1154 traveling around England and making preparations for reform of the kingdom, and perhaps to plot the succession of his son, William. One major port of call was the northern city of York. He then traversed the entire country again, heading for Dover in Kent in the southeast of England. It is plausible that this extensive travel exacerbated some pre-existing illnesses, although Stephen's death may also have been entirely unexpected. In any event, we do know that he fell ill after reaching Kent, complaining of a stomach ailment, and died shortly thereafter on the 25th of October, 1154. The exact cause of his death remains unclear. An ailment such as stomach cancer or severe gastritis may have been involved. He was quickly buried at Faversham Abbey in Kent. Stephen had patronized the establishment of the abbey just a few years earlier, and both his wife Matilda and their eldest son Eustace, who had died only so recently, were also interred there. The abbey was dissolved and largely destroyed in 1538 as part of the dissolution of England's monasteries during the English Reformation. In 1964, the empty tombs of Stephen and his family members were discovered, and there is a lack of clarity as to where their remains ended up after the 1530s. With local lore contending, their bones were thrown into a local creek. Stephen's death occurred at a broadly propitious time for bringing the long-running civil war to an end. Eustace's death a year earlier had ensured there was no power struggle between him and Henry, which there surely would have been had both men still been alive when Stephen died. Furthermore, with the Treaty of Wallingford having only so recently been negotiated, the other potential claimants to the throne were willing to accept Henry's succession as King Henry II of England. This new period of England's history is known as the Angevin Empire, to indicate Henry's descent through the House of Anjou and the extent of his territorial holdings on both sides of the English Channel. Under other circumstances, some of England's nobles might have encouraged Stephen's younger son William to push his claims to the throne, but after nearly 2 decades of civil war and destruction, peace was broadly favored by all. Henry II settled into a long reign. He would rule as King of England until 1189, though in time his own fractured family would sow disorder across England and Normandy, while the succession of his son John as king in 1199 ushered in an era in which the Angevins lost the bulk of their lands in northern France. Periods of civil war and disorder would punctuate England's medieval history every few decades for centuries to come. King Stephen has often been viewed poorly by historians of England and France in the High Middle Ages. The reasons for this are obvious. His long reign of nearly 2 decades was a period of near-continuous civil war, societal disruption, and economic destruction across England, so much so that it is known as the Anarchy. The chronicles and histories of the time present a picture of a country ravaged by the conflict between the supporters of Stephen and Matilda. Many historians since have understandably laid the blame for much of this on Stephen. And yet, this is possibly unfair. The crisis was created by a succession dispute which was generated to a large extent by the nobles of England and northern France, who were unwilling to accept Matilda as the successor to Henry I. Had they done so, the chaos could have been avoided. When it did begin, it was perpetuated by Matilda, Geoffrey, and then their son Henry. Stephen certainly played a part in all of this, but he was just one player in the whole sorry saga. Conversely, Henry I's promotion of him and the attitude of a great many feudal lords of England and northern France toward him would surely seem to indicate that Stephen was a capable figure of many good qualities. What was really at issue were structural weaknesses in the English and Norman state in the 12th century, and also the sheer happenstance of family creation. If Henry I had sired more legitimate sons, the anarchy would almost certainly have been avoided. That this wasn't the case was not Stephen's fault, though there is no doubting his centrality to the years of war and discord which followed the death of Henry I. As we drift towards sleep, we can reflect on how Stephen's story reminds us that even those who wear crowns are subject to the unpredictable currents of history. That sometimes the greatest disasters arise not from evil intentions, but from circumstances beyond any one person's control, and that in the quiet moments between conflict and peace, we find the true measure of those who would lead. What do you think of King Stephen? Was he responsible for the anarchy, or was he more of a symptom than a cause of the weaknesses of the Norman state in the 12th century? Sleep well, dear listener, and join us tomorrow for Part 2, where we'll explore the troubled reign of King John and discover how the grandson of the woman Stephen fought would bring his own form of chaos to medieval England. John, later known as King John of England and remembered for the Magna Carta, treachery and tyranny, was born during Christmastide in 1166 near either London or Oxford. John was the 8th and final child and the 5th boy born to his parents. John's father was King Henry II of England, born on the 5th of March, 1133, the eldest son to Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, Duke of Tyranny and Maine in what is today France. John's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was born in 1122 near Bordeaux. She was the eldest daughter of William Mex of Aquitaine and Anna of Châtellerault. Her father took special pride in his precocious daughter, who not only received a traditional female education, but was taught to read and write Latin. In addition, She learned the workings of government firsthand by sitting at her father's side as he managed his holdings. When her father died in 1137, Eleanor found herself in a precarious situation and needed assistance to protect her father's lands. She appealed to King Louis VI, who promptly betrothed her to his son. The king died soon after, and Louis VII and Eleanor were crowned king and queen on Christmas Day 1137, although they had 2 daughters. It was a loveless marriage, largely because Louis VII was so pious indeed he had intended to be a monk. In March of 1152, the council under the Archbishop of Sens declared their marriage annulled on the grounds that they were third cousins. This released Eleanor to find a husband to her liking. She did not wait long. 8 weeks after her divorce, she married a man she had seen paying homage to her then-husband the year before, Henry, Duke of Normandy. They married in May of 1152 and were destined to become the stuff of legend. They were the ultimate power couple, ambitious, headstrong, and formidable. It proved to be a tumultuous yet fruitful relationship. Eleanor bore 8 children, 5 boys and 3 girls. For her sons, she was not only a force to reckon with, but also a powerful influence on their lives. During John's lifetime, there were no true nation-states as we know them today, only a series of ducal and baronial landholdings, controlled by powerful leaders who continually fought each other for the right to rule and to expand their power base. A king was only the most powerful baron in that region and could be overthrown at any moment by another baron through armed conflict. Society was organized around a hierarchical structure that philosophers called the Great Chain of Being. In this great chain were 3 main links, those who work these being the peasants and artisans, those who fight such as kings, nobles, and knights, and those who pray including the Christian clergy, bishops, and the Pope. In addition to these divisions, there were those who were free or not bound to the land, and those who were unfree serfs who were bound to the land controlled by a king, baron, or bishop, and did his bidding. In addition to these layers, there was also a hierarchy of obligation, where the king could ask his barons for soldiers and resources to help him wage war, and those barons would then press those below them for the people and goods needed to fulfill this feudal commitment. Those who suffered most during conflicts were those who worked or were bound to the land because the powerful considered them. Expendable. Women also played a limited role in society. Only those women connected to powerful men through marriage or family ties, or those who served as nuns, could have any significant influence on historical events, such as John's mother, Eleanor, who knew how to pull the levers of power and wield military force as well as any man. She was the exception, however. Most women served as pawns in the power games of men who routinely used marriage as a way to gain control over more land or build key political connections. Because of this, most women of this time remain anonymous to us today. During this period, society also experienced explosive population growth that exerted new pressures, resulting in heightened creativity, economic growth, and increased wealth. To accommodate this change, huge trade networks formed all over Europe and into Africa and Asia. Christian religious art and Gothic architecture achieved some of their greatest magnificence. Innovative ideas in political philosophy likewise blossomed. These developments changed how people saw their world and their role within it. A few of these political ideas led to the societal thunderbolt known today as the Magna Carta, which had lasting implications on how government should be structured, including the enduring ideal that no one was above the law, even a king. Being the 5th son, John was not given much consideration by his father on matters of inheritance and marriage. In fact, his father would joke that John was sans terre, hence the sobriquet Lackland that would follow John throughout his life as a small child. John was taken to the monastery at Fontevraud, near Chinon, France, accompanied by his sister. Joan Fontevraud had some unique attributes that made it possible for John to receive the very best in literate education at that time. First, it was founded by Robert of Arbrissel, whose preaching attracted women from all walks of life. He became so popular that around 1101, he established a unique Benedictine monastery that housed both men and women. But unlike most other church structures, here it was the women who supervised the men. Secondly, it received patronage from the Counts of Anjou, and was considered their spiritual home. Eleanor's family also had a connection there. John and his sister Joan were not abandoned, but instead were surrounded and supported by people who functioned as an extension of their immediate family. It was an important enough place to the family that Eleanor, Henry II, Richard I, and several of John's sisters were buried there. It was a perfect place for John to get the rudiments of education in a nurturing environment. John learned to read and write both Latin and French. Based upon the books he owned, we know he had a grounding in topics such as astronomy, geography, biology, agriculture, medicine, and pharmaceuticals, the properties of metal and stone, art, and painting. John had a lifelong fascination with gemstones, which were often given to him as gifts from those seeking his favor. In addition, he had read widely in philosophy and literature, including authors like Pliny, St. Augustine, and Hugh of St. Victor. He played chess regularly and loved to hunt. According to some historians, John was probably one of the best educated men of his era. Furthermore, he was not completely alienated from his family. He did travel to England and to other parts of the realm for holidays and important ceremonies. At age 12, his family sent John to live with the household of Ranulph de Glanville, a trusted member of Henry II's government and the man who served as his justiciar, or chief minister in charge of administration in England when he was away on the continent. De Glanville was a powerful man and expert in government administration and finance. He even wrote a manual titled The Treatise on the Laws and Customs of England. By living in this man's household, John learned important lessons in finance, taxation, and administration that he would bring with him when he ruled as king. He also learned from Glanville how to manipulate that system for gain, even if it meant misrepresenting the facts or destroying others without just cause in order to reach some larger objective. It is striking that although John did have an education in the martial arts and could fight, it had never been the focus of his education, unlike his older brothers. This would have profound implications during his rule. What he gained from his education was an expertise in administration. Having taken his lessons from de Glanville to heart, John's grandmother on his father's side was Matilda, the daughter of Henry I, King of England and granddaughter of William the Conqueror. She was her father's sole legitimate heir. When her father died in 1135, the barons who had sworn fealty to her reneged on their allegiance and placed her cousin Stephen on the throne. She fought a bitter civil war over the next 20 years, known as the Anarchy, trying to regain the throne that was rightfully hers. In 1144, her husband Geoffrey conquered Normandy. In 1150, Geoffrey passed the title of Duke of Normandy on to his son Henry, who was then 17 years old. Henry had come of age during this conflict. The lessons he learned during the Anarchy created a formidable person both in military prowess and in political adeptness. He married Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152, adding one of the wealthiest regions in what would later become France to his landholdings. The following year, Henry invaded England to claim his mother's birthright. When Stephen's only son died later that year, he declared Henry as his heir to the throne of England. Stephen died in October 1154, and Henry assumed the throne later that same year on the 19th of December in a ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Henry now controlled land from the border with Scotland in the north to the Pyrenees in the south more than any other king at that time. This made him one of the wealthiest landholders in Europe, and, as a result, the most powerful ruler in Christendom. Although Henry II was technically a vassal to the King of France, since he only ruled as a duke or count over his continental holdings, and was obligated to pay homage, he chose to ignore this legal technicality and function as if he were king over all of his territory, much to the annoyance of the French kings. Energetic and authoritative, Henry spent his entire reign restoring order after the Anarchy, consolidating power, and creating bureaucratic systems to manage his vast landholdings and raising funds to support his government and the army that enforced it. This governmental system laid the foundations for what would happen during John's reign. Henry also deftly managed many conflicts as king, including a rebellion of his sons and wife. Although he had 5 sons, only 2 outlived him. Richard, nicknamed the Lionheart, and John. Although John was the youngest son, Henry had not forgotten about him. In fact, there is some evidence that John was his favorite son. Yet Henry had an equity problem, having already divided his lands between his other 3 living sons because the Treaty of Montmirail required him to do so. He lacked additional land to give John, so he looked to marriage as a way to ensure his youngest son's inheritance. Even though John was only 6, Henry betrothed him to Alice, heiress of Humbert III, Count of Maurienne and Savoy. At the time, it was a good political move for Henry, but Alice died the following year, in 1174, while Henry beat back a rebellion led by his sons and wife once. He pacified his sons, imprisoned his wife, and restored order in his kingdom. He searched for another solution for John's livelihood. Henry took advantage of the deaths of Reginald, Earl of Cornwall, and William, Earl of Gloucester, since neither one had sired sons who could inherit their lands. He betrothed Isabella of Gloucester to John, set aside maintenance funds for the other girls, and gave the estates to John. Then he realized the perfect solution might be found to the west in Ireland. He had acted there before, having invaded in 1155 and again in 1171. Following these invasions, few English barons had established estates there. In 1177, Henry called a council at Oxford with the express purpose of pronouncing John as King of Ireland. At only 10 years old, John received direct homage from the English barons with Irish holdings. Even so, he remained largely uninvolved in his father's court. This changed in 1183. John's brothers were jockeying for dominance on the continent in this case, literally waging war on one another. Richard resented the fact that Henry the Young, king, the oldest living brother, had been crowned with his coronation in 1170. During one engagement, the young king became ill with dysentery and died on the 11th of June, 1183. Suddenly, the whole inheritance situation fell apart. Henry made Richard his direct heir, giving him the lands that Henry the young king had held. John was to receive Aquitaine, which had been under Richard's control. This reshuffling proved a disaster, as Richard refused to give up Aquitaine, having garnered support from the people there. Neither Richard nor Henry would yield on this issue. That winter, Henry ordered John and his older brother Geoffrey to wage war on Richard. The two brothers made little headway against their more skilled older brother. Yet this skirmish bought Henry time to rethink the situation. His solution was to bring all 3 sons to England with the excuse that a new archbishop had to be chosen. The real intent, however, was to present a public show of unity among himself and his sons. When the new archbishop presented the kiss of peace on all 4 men, it strengthened the appearance of solidarity. Henry then sent Geoffrey to Normandy and kept Richard and John with him in England. It was clear to Richard he would not be moving directly into Henry's role as the new young king. However, as far as Henry was concerned, with the situation modified, for now, it was time to revisit Ireland. Although the Pope had yet to agree to John's becoming King of Ireland, Henry pressed ahead anyway, settling on the title of Lord of Ireland for his son. Like much of Europe at that time, Ireland was not governed as a nation, but was instead in constant political turmoil, with boundaries of kingdoms continually shifting. While the English had established some centers of dominance, their hold was precarious. Henry's representative there was Hugh de Lacy, who controlled the Irish kingdom of Meath and the city of Dublin through sheer determination and active involvement. In Irish politics, de Lacy also gained control of Leinster under orders from Henry. Preparations to travel to Ireland began in earnest in the summer of 1184, including sending John Cumin, the Archbishop of Dublin, with instructions to prepare for John's arrival. Philip of Worcester, a key military leader under Henry II, became the commander of the expedition. On the 31st of March, 1185, Henry knighted John at Windsor Castle, a clear message to all that John, now 18, was ready for adult responsibilities. This would prove premature, however. On April 24th, John and his entourage sailed to Ireland, arriving the following day. The young officers in his group approached the Irish leaders with disdain, poking fun at their huge beards and even going so far as to tug on them. Following this display of disrespect, these leaders now turned against English rule. John compounded the problem further by taking the land of Irish supporters as if it were his own, and redistributing it to his English cohorts, leading to reprisal. Raids by the Irish Donn de Lacy, who might have modified the situation, did little to stop it. These conflicts required John to expend the available funds for defense. By early autumn, he returned to England financially ruined. His venture had proved a folly. As a result, Richard rose in Henry's eyes. A new crisis hit the Angevin dynasty. The following year, on August 19, 1186, Henry's fourth son, Geoffrey, died during a tournament in Paris. Suddenly, John found himself even closer to the throne. Richard clearly saw the threat John posed to him. Then, to make things even worse for Henry, the French king, Philip Augustus, who had become king in 1180 after his father, Louis VII, had died, declared that Geoffrey's lands in Brittany were to be given back to the French crown. If Henry failed to relinquish them, Philip threatened to take Normandy by force. For the next 3 years, Philip continued to cause trouble. Richard also pestered his father to declare him official heir, even allying himself with Philip. The situation deteriorated to the point that father and son were at war with each other. Just before he died on the 6th of July, 1189, while on his deathbed, Henry asked for a list naming all those who had allied themselves against him. As the story goes, the first name on the list was his favored son, John. Many chroniclers at the time declared it was this shock that killed the king. Richard's first action as the heir apparent was to attend the burial of his father at Fontevraud. He then settled his estates on the continent. After Richard officially became Duke of Normandy, he returned to England. Richard knew that John could either be his best friend or his worst foe. In an attempt to curry favor, Richard granted John land in both England and on the continent and permitted him to marry Isabella of Gloucester on the 3rd of September 1189. Richard held his coronation at Westminster Abbey on the 3rd of September 1189, with both John and their mother Eleanor in attendance. The next day, John, along with other nobles of the realm, paid homage and swore fealty to the new king. Richard declared John to be the Lord John, the king's brother. To everyone, it appeared that the two brothers would rule England with filial love. Now Richard had to settle his affairs because he had promised the Pope he would go on a crusade to the Holy Land. He did not put John in charge because he did not feel his brother was ready for the position. He selected 2 co-justiciars instead, William de Mandeville, Earl of Essex, and Hugh de Puisay, Bishop of Durham. Both men were older and exceptional talents in government administration. They had also proven consistently loyal to the Angevins, and, more importantly, to Richard. Initially, Richard appointed John as the head of the army. John received his first mission, which was to pacify a rebellion in South Wales, led by Rhys ap Gruffydd, the king of the southern Welsh. At first, things appeared to be going well, but then disaster struck. William de Mandeville died that December, and Richard now had to find a replacement. He appointed William de Longchamp, a longtime Richard loyalist who had a prickly personality. Richard's behavior toward John began to change soon after this appointment. The question of naming his heir became even trickier, especially as he was losing faith in John. But Richard did have other options. Their brother Geoffrey had a son named Arthur, and by the rule of English royal inheritance, Arthur had a stronger claim. Although he was only 2 years old, Richard's troubles compounded further as his 2 justiciars could not get along. Early in 1190, he put du Puiset in charge of the north and appointed de Longchamp the sole justiciar. Richard then took John to Normandy and ordered him to stay on the continent. He would not be permitted to enter England without Richard's specific permission. Richard left on crusade on the 15th of July, 1190, and while in Sicily, declared Arthur as his true heir. De Longchamp continued maneuvering behind the scenes against John, including getting the King of the Scots to support Arthur's claim to the throne. De Longchamp also placed du Puiset under arrest. Unaware of de Longchamp's behavior, Richard asked Pope Clement III to make de Longchamp a legate of the Apostolic See. After this, he began acting above his station and often behaved as if he were king. At this time, he was making powerful enemies. including John by the spring of 1191. The conflict between John and de Longchamp had become public when de Longchamp attacked holdings of John's supporters. John counterattacked. He did what he could to keep de Longchamp's aggressive behavior at bay. When the Archbishop of Canterbury died, confusion erupted over who to appoint. Richard wanted William of Monreale, but de Longchamp wanted the position for himself. During this controversy, Richard began to understand that all was not well in his kingdom. He asked one of the men in his group of crusaders, longtime Angevin supporter who had served for Angevin Kings Walter of Coutances, to return to England to regain order. John continued to play the role of a dutiful brother, determined to support Richard and his kingdom. What finally led to the removal of de Longchamp was his arrest and brutal treatment of the Archbishop of York. After a great council reviewed the events, Longchamp was removed as justiciar. This council also agreed that John be made supreme, governor of the whole realm, with the consent of Walter, the Archbishop of Rouen, now the new chief justiciar, with the assistance of William Marshal, another trusted Angevin supporter who had served in many key government posts under Henry II. De Longchamp, protested mightily against his ill treatment and declared his downfall the result of the scheming John. John found himself in the seat of power and knew that Richard might not return from the crusade, so he began to solidify his support, being careful not to make de Longchamp's mistakes. The realm appeared quiet and secure for a short time under John's care, until Philip Augustus, now King of France, returned early from the Third Crusade. Although Richard and he had made a peace treaty while they were on crusade, Philip chose not to keep his word and began maneuvering to take back lands from the English king that he felt rightfully belonged to him. Rumors flew about John and who he might truly support. De Longchamp even reappeared briefly under a bribing scheme that John supposedly used to gain supporters. Some rumors hinted that John had gone over to Philip's side in an attempt to take the throne. Richard left the Holy Land on the 9th of October, 1192. He made great progress until he was captured near Vienna by Duke Leopold of Austria, who passed him to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who held Richard hostage and demanded a ransom to be paid for his release. John learned about this in January of 1193. His impulsive nature failed him this time, for he thought that this meant that Richard might never return, and it was his chance to claim the throne. John went to Paris to create an alliance with King Philip, then returned to England and did the same with the King of Scots. Eleanor, his mother, built up the defenses along the coast in Kent and prepared to repel Flemish or French invaders. Philip attacked Normandy only to be repelled. Civil war broke out in England, but was stopped by the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Hubert Walter, who had instructions on how the ransom was to be paid. He insisted that the effort now had to be the raising of the necessary funds to get Richard released, resulting in John leaving England to meet with Philip in order to re-establish the truce between the king and Richard. In the end, Henry VI released Richard on the 4th of February, 1194. In April, John and Richard met at Lisieux with their mother mediating. John begged forgiveness, and Richard provided a patronizing response to his younger brother. According to chroniclers, he said, "John, have no fear. You are a child, and you had bad men looking after you." Despite John being 27 years old, both Richard and Eleanor did not see good things in John. Eleanor said that John had the shallow mind of an adolescent. Richard's assessment that John lacked the ability to stand up to someone who opposed him proved prophetic. Richard pulled lands away from John as punishment. It took time for Richard to forgive John for his betrayal, but eventually he did. John gradually played more important roles in Richard's court, starting in May 1195, when Richard returned John's lands to him in Gloucester and Mortha. By July 1197, Richard had forgiven John for his poor judgment and declared that he was to be his preferred successor. John received more land grants and other signs of favor from his brother. John also began to pull powerful allies around him, including two men, Hubert Walter and William Marshal. The rumor that John had fallen into Philip's camp never died. In early 1199, Philip told Richard this and showed him some documents that backed up his claim. When John heard of this accusation, he sent 2 knights to the French court to repudiate the charges. Richard was relieved by this and again declared John his true and only heir. It proved an important moment, as on the 6th of April, 1199, Richard died of gangrene after being hit by a crossbow bolt in his shoulder while attacking the castle of Chalais-Chabrol in Limoges. Although Richard's wishes had to be taken into consideration, it did not mean that powerful men had to honor them. It did not help that Richard throughout his reign had been fickle in his opinion on the matter, presenting both Arthur and Otto of Brunswick, the son of their sister Matilda, as possible heirs. During this succession confusion, Eleanor made sure that John received the region of Aquitaine. Another problem stemmed from the fact that no one in the realm fully trusted John, especially after his power grab during Richard's captivity. It took the stellar reputations of Hubert, Walter, and William Marshal to ensure John obtained the English crown, and with it the Angevin lands. On the 25th of April, John was invested as the Duke of Normandy. His mother then moved to secure the rest of the continental lands. Meanwhile, Philip moved his troops against Normandy, but failed to make any headway. John hurriedly sailed to England to secure his position as king. On the 27th of May, 1199, Ascension Day, John became the anointed King of England, crowned by Hubert Walter at Westminster Abbey, after he received oaths of allegiance from his barons and established his administration. It was time to address outstanding issues on the continent, namely Arthur. At this time, English kings had a peculiar relationship with the King of France. They did not have full control over the Angevin lands, but had to pay homage to the King of France. This is why John always signed his letters as King of England, Lord of Ireland, Duke of Normandy, and Aquitaine, and Count of Anjou. For obvious reasons, this created great strain between the 2 rulers. And Philip Augustus, unlike his forebears, had determined he would fight until he had returned all Angevin continental lands to his direct control, removing the component of the English king if possible, or finding a more pliable puppet if not. Philip saw the perfect tool to do so by supporting Arthur as the true heir to the English throne. For John, although he served as the King of England, his ancestral heart was in Anjou and Aquitaine, so losing these lands would hurt him personally. John headed to Normandy to meet with Philip. Their 3-day meeting started on the 17th of August, and did not go as either one would have liked. Philip did not negotiate in good faith and made it clear whom he had chosen to support. Since Arthur paid homage to Philip for his control over Anjou, Poitou, Maine, Touraine, Brittany, and Normandy, Philip insisted that John relinquish control over these lands, especially the most eastern portion of Normandy, the Vexin. The Vexin region had been fought over 4 years because the river Seine, which connected Paris with the sea, flowed through there. For Philip's security, it was critical that the French king controlled it, but John balked at all of Philip's demands. It was clear that John had to marshal his continental supporters to block attacks from Philip. John also contacted foreign leaders for their support, including the Count of Flanders as well as his nephew Otto of Brunswick. By August, John had received enough homage from many of Richard's former supporters in his continental realms that it appeared that he had the upper hand. When Philip tried to test their resolve, such as in Le Mans, John's supporters repelled his attack. John at one point almost had Arthur in his grasp until he and his mother fled back to Brittany. John also used his time to arrange for himself a new wife, after his marriage to Isabella of Gloucester had been annulled due to their being related. Soon after his coronation, he settled on 12-year-old Isabella, daughter of the Count of Angoulême and heiress to his lands. Isabella was already betrothed to Count Hugh Le Brun of the Lusignan family, but that did not seem to deter John because he saw the alliance with her father as strategically expedient. He failed to consider that he might alienate the powerful Lusignan clan by his actions. John would pay for his impulsiveness, since John had now solidified his control over the southern portion of his realm. He focused on addressing the issue of who controlled Normandy. John and Philip met in a place called La Goulette. The resulting Treaty of La Goulette, completed in May 1200, proved to be a triumph for John. Not only did Philip acknowledge that John was Richard's rightful heir, but it also placed Brittany firmly in the hands of John, with his nephew Arthur obligated to pay him homage. Moreover, John retained his claim on both Poitou and Anjou. For these benefits, John gave Philip some key concessions. These included John's refusal to aid his nephew Otto in his struggle against Philip. The counts in Flanders and Boulogne had to pay homage to the French king, and the treaty instituted a complete ban on castle building throughout Normandy. He also agreed to pay Philip fees of 20,000 marks sterling. Although they established a new border in the Vexin, neither side got what they wanted to cement the deal. John's niece Blanche, daughter of his sister Eleanor, was betrothed to Philip's son and heir, Louis. John, pleased with his diplomatic work, headed south to collect his bride, Lebrun, furious that no one consulted him nor compensated him for his financial loss, switched to Arthur's camp. John and Isabella were hastily married on St. Bartholomew's Day, the 24th of August, 1200, at the St. Pierre Cathedral in Angoulême. Once she reached childbearing age, Isabella and John would have 5 children, 2 of them boys. Not everyone saw John's actions at Lagula or in Angoulême as a strategic success. With the high payment to King Philip, losing portions of the Vexin and other concessions, they felt he had given away too much. A few resurrected the nickname Richard once gave John, soft-sword, implying that he had let Philip walk all over him. As his brother said, John had a hard time standing up to others, and John had made powerful enemies with his impulsive, short-sighted actions, such as alienating Lebrun, who fomented trouble throughout Anjou and Aquitaine. King Philip saw an opportunity in this rebellion. Tensions increased so much that John returned to Normandy and began private conversations with Philip. While remaining polite on the surface, Philip worked behind the scenes, providing support to anyone in the region that asked for his help against John. He also began a campaign of defaming John, declaring he had mistreated his men and was not fit to rule. He insisted that John give up his lands in Poitou, Anjou, and Aquitaine. To emphasize this point, he knighted Arthur and pronounced him the liege lord of these lands. Fighting increased since Arthur's supporters now had the French king's public support and a reason to fight, that is, to push John out. It did not help that Isabella's father, the Count of Angoulême, died in July. Eleanor, John's mother, clearly understood the gravity of the situation and moved to Mirabeau in Poitou in August 1202 to manage the war effort, only to find herself under siege by her own nephew Arthur. Upon discovering this, John dropped everything and raced 90 miles to rescue her. With overwhelming force and surprise on their side, John managed to crush Arthur's troops and save his mother. An added bonus was his capture of both Lebrun and Arthur. Yet the troubles did not end there. Another siege arose. At this time Mitt was against Chinon, where his wife was visiting her mother. This rebellion was put down, and he and his wife stayed with Count Robert of Sees in Alencon. Thinking all was well, they left to head north, but Philip had been waiting to pounce. The day after John left, Philip seized this strategic city. Angered, John moved Arthur to Rouen Castle in April 1203. Following this, Arthur disappeared, and rumors began to fly around Europe. Some said John tried to talk reason with him, but then killed him in a drunken rage, throwing him into the Seine. The more lurid tales included poking out Arthur's eyes and cutting off his genitals before disposing of his body in the river. Following this incident, John's bad reputation plummeted even further. John now worked to repair the damage on the continent, but had little success. Although he was able to get the new Pope Innocent III's support to help mediate his disputes with Philip, the discussions went nowhere, as Philip knew he had a chance to remove the English from France. He attacked Normandy in earnest and removed John as his vassal in this region, effectively eliminating his right to the territory. The barons there had to choose between following a disgraced duke or upholding their legal duty by supporting their new liege lord. Seeing no other option, John returned to England, making landfall on the 7th of December, 1203. This action was a mistake on 2 accounts. First, his supporters who were left behind to continue the fight against Philip felt abandoned by their king. Second, It reinforced the view that John had no backbone. John assumed he would be back soon after he had raised funds and marshaled enough troops to continue the fight. He also pulled in allies abroad, including Otto of Brunswick, and sent delegations to the Pope asking for assistance. Pope Innocent wrote to Philip to cease his attack on Normandy or face harsh consequences. But Philip ignored this. On the 1st of March 1204, one of the strongest fortresses in Normandy fell to Chateau Galliard. By June, King Philip had full control over Normandy, and John had lost all of his continental inheritance. At first, he had interpreted this as the result of God's anger and tried to appease him through payments to holy houses such as the Cistercian Abbey of Beaulieu. Feeling he had bribed God enough, he then focused all of his efforts on regaining his inheritance. He took everything he had learned from de Glanville and began to pull money from his barons, the royal forests, and even the church in order to raise funds for an invasion force. In July, the faithful Hubert Walter, the Archbishop of Canterbury, died. John saw this as an opportunity to replace him with a trusted supporter, John de Grey, the Bishop of Norwich. The monks, who usually played a key role in this decision, wanted their sub-prior Reginald to be the new archbishop instead. The Pope disagreed on both counts, preferring Stephen Langton, who was a scholar of theology in Paris and had promoted new ideas about the rights of kings. Tensions grew, however, because no one in England wanted Langton. Meanwhile, John made preparations to return to Poitou throughout 1205 and into 1206. He also worked on a flurry of correspondence with the Pope, including sending a delegation to try to persuade the Pope to understand that a king must have some say in a political appointment. As important as the Archbishop of Canterbury, in June 1206, John set sail to La Rochelle. His goal was to regain his lost homeland, but Philip made sure he did not. While John did have some success in regaining Gascony and some of Poitou, he did not pull his father's homeland of Anjou away from Philip. John sailed home with a 2-year truce and a better understanding of what kind of military he would need to build in order to defeat Philip. Throughout 1207, John developed innovative ways to extract funds from his barons, church, and royal forests to finance an attack on France. While he did raise a great deal of money, it also led to the decrease of coinage in the country, which increased the cost of living, hurting everyone financially. It was at this time that Isabella gave birth to John's first son, Henry. On the 1st of October 1207, Pope Innocent determined it was time to press John into accepting Langton as the new archbishop and had him consecrated. John's reaction was a military one, taking Canterbury by force. Innocent sent letters to English barons and bishops insisting they convince John to accept Langton. Between John also pressing his case and the Pope demanding compliance, the English bishops split over who to support. This was a consequential issue for them, as the ability to control who could select leaders in the church was at stake. In March 1208, while John prepared again to go to Poitou, the Pope placed England under an interdict, which meant that the sacraments could no longer be administered in England, denying the populace the comforts of the church. Rather than bowing to this pressure as Innocent had hoped he might, John saw it as an opportunity to seize church property to raise funds for his military campaign in France, and to shore up his English defenses. He pressed his countrymen for money even harder, including calling in all debts from his barons in England, threatening to throw them into prison if they failed to pay. He even attacked longtime supporters such as Richard's point man William de Braose and even William Marshall. John also increased fines and fees for legal actions and violations in royal forests. The situation in England continued to deteriorate when Isabella gave birth to their second son, Richard, on the 5th of January 1209. In August, John headed north to confront William, King of Scotland, after hearing rumors of an alliance between Scotland and France. Confronted with military force, William yielded to John's demands and submitted his country to England through the Treaty of Norham. To ensure William's compliance, his 2 daughters were taken as hostages. Meanwhile, furious that John still refused to yield to his demands, Innocent excommunicated him in November 1209, placing John in grave political danger. In desperation, he set to flush out the enemies in his midst. First, in 1210, John returned to Ireland to collect debts and to reaffirm his control of the region. This turned ugly, especially John's treatment of de Braose, and fearful of his life, de Braose fled to Normandy. In response, John arrested his wife and son, throwing them into the stronghold of Corfe on the southern coast of England, where he starved them to death. As the story goes, the jailer found them holding each other as they died, but it appeared that Lady de Braose had nibbled on her son's face in hungry desperation. In 1211, with Ireland under his control, John then turned to Wales, where he put down a rebellion led by Llywelyn ab Iorwerth of Gwynedd, who was forced to submit to John and recognize him as overlord of Wales. Although these actions appeared to be violent acts of a desperate man, John had managed to pull all four countries together under one sovereign for the first time in history. By the summer of 1212, John's efforts to build his military and naval fleet had gone well. His diplomatic efforts had also borne fruit, with agreements with the Count of Boulogne, the Duke of Limburg, the Count of Flanders, and his nephew, now Emperor Otto IV, in place to help him defeat Philip. John felt ready to head back to France to regain his birthright, but more pressing issues intruded. With the people increasingly exasperated with their excommunicated king and his brutal taxation, rumors spread across the country that a prophet, Peter of Wakefield, predicted that John could not survive past Ascension Day, the 23rd of May, 1213. If this story had not made him paranoid, then the discovery of a real plot to murder him surely did. Hatched by disgruntled northern nobles, the plot was put down, but the culprits escaped capture. As a result of this incident, John realized he had gone too far and began to relax some of his harshest administrative actions. John also clearly understood that Philip wanted to go beyond sweeping him out of France. He wanted to sweep him out of England and was making preparations to achieve this. Philip could easily acquire the support of the Pope to depose an excommunicated king. And so in late 1212, John sent representatives to Pope Innocent to negotiate. Early compromises were struck, including permitting the church to fill vacancies, and the priests could perform last communion on the dying. Yet Innocent insisted that John agreed to his terms, including allowing Langton to become archbishop. With the threat of Philip on the horizon, John capitulated. On the 15th of May, 1213, John not only submitted to the Pope officially via his papal legate Pandolf Veracio, but handed all of England and Ireland into the care of the Pope and agreed to pay him 1,000 marks per year. On Ascension Day 1213, John celebrated his return to the Christian fold. He had survived the prophecy of his demise. However, Philip ignored recent events and continued to prepare his ships to sail to England. On the 30th of May, while Philip attacked the city of Ghent, the English navy pulled up to the near-empty French ships in the harbor and set them ablaze, destroying Philip's fleet. Known today as the Battle of Dam, when word of this action reached John, it must have felt as if he had regained God's favor, and so he prepared to sail to La Rochelle to reclaim his family's patrimony. John planned a pincer-like attack to squeeze Philip on two fronts, using his forces in southern France and his allies' forces in the north. He arrived in La Rochelle on the 15th of February 1214 to great praise from the mayor and citizens. He began to work his way through Aquitaine and Poitou, including taking down key supporters of Philip, such as the Lusignan family, and capturing Philip's cousin Robert of Dreux. Things moved quickly until July. During his siege of Rosumon, for some unknown reason, John, after hearing that Philip's son Louis was on his way, retreated, fearing a large force. Surprisingly, Louis had made the same decision because he was not prepared to attack John in an open engagement. Yet on the 15th of July, when John wanted to re-engage, he asked former supporters who had not turned out to come to his aid. But no one arrived to support him, and so John turned south to solidify his control there. Meanwhile, a decisive open field battle happened several hundred miles away in Bouvines, north of Paris, where a coalition of key Western European powers attacked Philip on the 27th of July 1214, in what would become known as the Battle of Bouvines. It was a brutal conflict, with numerous casualties on both sides. In the end, it was Philip who came out on top. Not only was it one of the most critical battles in the lives of John and Philip, but it also helped to reshape the map of Europe. Upon hearing the result of this battle, John headed home, arriving in Corfe on the 18th of October 1214. While he had been away, unrest among the barons of northern England had arisen. John, wanting to engage them militarily, discovered he had few financial resources at his disposal, because almost no one had made their payments to the exchequer. He had little choice but to meet with his barons, with the first meeting scheduled for January 1215. At that meeting, the delegation of barons explained to John that he had to agree to Henry I's charter. John delayed responding by agreeing to meet again on the 26th of April, which he did not honor. He also failed to respond to the baronial demands denoted in a document that would become known as the Unknown Charter, which read like the charter of Henry I, but with additional clauses added. Meanwhile, John prepared for war against his barons. Knowing that Innocent wanted a fifth crusade, John contacted the Pope and pledged himself to go on crusade. Much to Innocent's delight, the Pope responded with 2 letters. One to the barons, telling them to back down and swear allegiance to their king, and the second to Langton and his bishops, ordering them to ensure a peaceful settlement. Everyone now knew that John had papal support and therefore might not negotiate in good faith. On the 5th of May, the barons renounced their feudal obligations in response and armed themselves. John then issued 2 letters, one stating that disputes should be brought before the Pope, who would act as arbiter. The other stated that during the time of negotiations, there would be a moratorium on engagement against his barons. On the 17th of May, the barons responded by taking control of London, cheered on by the citizens of the city. Now that John no longer controlled his capital, he had to parley with his barons. He could stall no longer, and John asked Langton to facilitate negotiations. It was agreed to meet at a neutral place called Runnymede along the Thames River between Windsor Castle and Staines. On the 10th of June, John offered safe conduct to the barons, but just for a short duration to permit time for talks. Yet most of the negotiations had already happened between Langton and the barons. The document that was placed before John on that fateful day of the 15th of June, 1215, was a document called the Articles of the Barons, which spelled out their demands. A few days later, on the 19th of June, a group of the barons met John at Runnymede, where they paid homage to the king and renewed their oaths of loyalty. The document they agreed upon promised access to swift justice to the barons. It limited the king's rights over taxation and feudal payments, as well as providing protection from unlawful imprisonment and protection of church rights. There was also a security clause whereby the barons could check that John was adhering to the demands laid down by the charter. These articles form the basis of what we today know as the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter in English, and this document would be rewritten and elaborated over the coming years. Although the Magna Carta is seen today as one of the cornerstones of Western liberty, an inspection of the document itself demonstrates that it lacks the poetic verses of the Declaration of Independence, as it was in essence a peace treaty between John and his barons, which simply listed the limitations of John's power. Indeed, the Magna Carta would be reissued several times after John's death, each time in a shorter format, eliminating the most contentious clauses. John did not sign the document because that was not typical at the time. Instead, the document was folded and formally sealed with John's royal seal. The sealed document had to be revised to sound like it came from the king before it was copied and distributed throughout the land. Yet no one believed this was the end of the conflict between John and the barons. King John sent a copy of the document to the Pope, complaining about the barons. The Pope, shocked that a king would have to capitulate to his subjects, declared the charter null and void, and by September, civil war had broken out, with the king laying siege to the strategically critical Rochester Castle, which was under the control of the barons. Meanwhile, some of the barons asked Louis to become their king. Since many of the rebellious barons hailed from the northern counties, they chose to pay homage to Alexander II, the son of William, who was the new king of Scotland, and asked him to move south to support them. John finally took Rochester Castle, and then built upon that success by making other conquests in both East Anglia and the northern counties of England. Yet his naval blockade had failed to stop Louis from landing in England on the 21st of May, 1216. A few days later, Louis triumphantly entered the city of London. His troops then besieged Dover, Lincoln, and Windsor, while Scottish forces wreaked havoc in the north. John did his best to keep up the defenses and keep the French troops away with the help of Gualabikiri, the papal legate who was sent by the Pope to protect John from the French. While Louis found himself bogged down at Dover Castle in late summer, John swept through the loyal heartlands in the western and central parts of England, trying to rally support to push the French out. On the 9th of October, John arrived in East Anglia and was received well by those at Lynn, who invited him to a large feast at which John contracted dysentery. Even though he was starting to feel ill, he continued to move north. On the 12th of October, near the nunnery of Swin, he received word that a portion of his baggage train had been lost in the wash and quicksand of the Well Stream estuary. Apparently, John's mobile altar, including holy relics along with his crown, were lost by the 14th of October. He was too sick to get out of bed and wrote letters to the new Pope Honorius III explaining the situation, requesting aid and reminding Honorius that England had been placed under papal care. On the 16th of October, too sick to ride, John was transported on a litter to Newark. Although medical administrations such as bleeding were applied, nothing could be done to help the king. On the 18th of October, John furiously worked to settle his estate, reward his stalwart supporters, and ensure the safety of his two sons. King John died on the 19th of October, 1216, knowing his reign had been a catastrophic failure. At his request, he was buried in the Cathedral of Worcester, where his crypt can be seen today. Although his death did not end the baronial civil war, it did change the stakes considerably. It was no longer a fight to rid England of John, but the question remained of who would replace him. The choice became either the French Louis or the English heir. 9-year-old Henry William Marshal had been made guardian of John's sons Henry and 7-year-old Richard. Having served several Angevin kings, he knew what the stakes were. Henry III's first coronation, hurriedly, took place in Gloucester on the 28th of October, with Gualabikiri performing the ceremony. No one in the land could dispute the integrity or the ability of the now regent William Marshal, who was 70 and would rule for the benefit of the young king with the assistance of a council of 13 able barons and bishops. Now that King John was dead, Louis assumed that he had won and stopped at Dover Castle to demand that Hubert de Burgh, a staunch Angevin loyalist, should come out and talk. De Burgh refused and prepared to continue fighting, while Louis just walked away. The final nails in the coffin for Louis's kingship in England were two decisive battles. The Battle of Lincoln Castle, where the forces under Marshal resoundingly defeated the baronial and French adversaries on the 20th of May 1217, and the Battle of Sandwich, in which the naval forces under de Burgh defeated the French on the 24th of August. On the 20th of September, the Treaty of Lambeth ended the hostilities, and Louis headed home to France, although the document that would become known as the Magna Carta had failed in its original intent. William Marshal and Gualabikiri clearly understood its importance as a tool to create a covenant between the king and his people. They reissued the document on the 6th of November 1217, along with the Charter of the Forest, a similar agreement about the king's right to use and tax royal forest lands. In 1225, Henry III reissued both documents in his request to tax movable items, and in 1237, Henry again presented the document at a meeting in Westminster that had been promoted as a parliament. The Angevins had abused their power to promote their own personal interests at the expense of their nobles and the common people of England. Tension had built with each successive reign. John, an excellent administrator but a poor strategist, took this abuse to new heights and forced the barons to turn on their king. Yet the resulting agreement became an important tool to reach mutual agreements without bloodshed. As we know from English history, it did not always work out that way. Even so, the Magna Carta established a written covenant between the people. and their rulers that served as a model for the democratic governments we treasure today. As we drift toward peaceful sleep, we can reflect on how both Stephen and John's stories remind us that power without wisdom leads to chaos, that even kings must answer to something greater than themselves, and that sometimes from the darkest periods of history emerge the brightest lights of progress. What do you think of King John? Was he truly evil and the worst king England ever had? Or was he a victim of circumstance and a product of the time in which he lived? Sleep well, dear listener, and remember that even in the most troubled reigns, we find the seeds of better days ahead. Let these gentle tales of medieval England carry you softly into your dreams.